Before Jesus taught, he said this, the Aramaic secret that changes everything. There is a moment preserved in ancient manuscripts, studied by Aramaic scholars, and hidden in plain sight within the fabric of the Gospels, when Jesus did not simply open his mouth and begin to speak. There is a moment preserved in ancient manuscripts, studied by Aramaic scholars, and hidden in plain sight within the fabric of the Gospels, when Jesus did not simply open his mouth and begin to speak. And here is what no seminary, no Sunday sermon, and no theological commentary has ever told you. The reason anxiety blocks you from receiving life-changing truth today is the exact same condition. Invocation was built to dissolve 2,000 years ago. The anxious mind is a closed system, sealed off from depth, sealed off from transformation, sealed off from the divine signal that truth carries when it arrives at its full frequency. Jesus knew this about human beings before modern neuroscience had a language for it, and he built the solution into the opening of every teaching he ever gave. Today, that ancient Aramaic word Abwoon is going to change not just what you hear, but how deeply you are able to receive. Every teaching Jesus ever delivered was preceded by an invisible act that most lifelong gospel readers have completely overlooked. It was not a grand ceremonial gesture or a priestly ritual borrowed from the temple traditions of his time. It was a single Aramaic utterance, a word that functioned less like a conventional address to God and more like a precision instrument, adjusting the interior frequency of every person present before a single teaching could penetrate and take lasting root. That word was Abwoon. And what it accomplished in those ancient hillside gatherings, it is fully capable of accomplishing in youth today. To understand why Jesus used Abwoon as his invocation before every teaching moment, you first need to understand the interior condition of the people standing before him. When the crowds gathered in Galilee or in the narrow streets of Jerusalem to hear Jesus speak, they were not arriving as serene, empty vessels, ready to receive divine wisdom. They came the way most of us encounter spiritual content in this century. Anxious, overstimulated, internally cluttered, and weighted down with preformed judgments about what they were about to hear. Their minds were full before the first word of any teaching had been spoken, full of fear about tomorrow, full of grief unprocessed from years of loss, full of the relentless daily pressure of survival under Roman occupation, one of the most suffocating political realities the ancient world had ever imposed on a people. Jesus understood, with a clarity that preceded modern neuroscience by 20 centuries, that an anxious mind is a fundamentally closed mind, not closed through stubbornness or spiritual unwillingness, but closed by biological and spiritual design. When the human nervous system is locked inside threat response mode, the deeper layers of consciousness, the very layers where spiritual truth registers, where meaning is genuinely made, where lasting inner transformation becomes possible, go completely offline. The mind gripped by anxiety can absorb noise, but it cannot receive light. It can accumulate data, but it cannot hold revelation. This is precisely where Abwoon entered, as the necessary and irreplaceable first act. In its deep Aramaic root structure, this word points directly to the sacred breath, the divine animation that underlies and sustains all created life. It was not merely a title for God. It was an acoustic event, a vibrational opening that moved through the air and through the body simultaneously. When Jesus voiced Abwoon, he was doing something structurally profound. He was inviting the listener's entire being to reorganize itself around a different center, to exhale the contracting grip of anxiety, and inhale the spacious, divine readiness that authentic spiritual receiving requires. That was the invocation. That was the precision, and it is still available to you. The Aramaic language that Jesus spoke every day of his earthly life was not simply a communication tool. It was a resonant system, a language in which the sounds themselves carried vibrational meaning that operated beneath the level of conscious thought, working directly on the body, the breath, and the interior state of the listener. When Aramaic scholars spent decades translating the Lord's Prayer, the prayer Jesus himself composed and delivered in Aramaic, they discovered that the very first word Abwoon was untranslatable by any single English equivalent without losing the majority of its true and living meaning. The word is typically rendered as Father in English translations, and while that rendering carries a fragment of the original, it captures perhaps 10% of what the Aramaic actually contains. Abwoon is formed from the root ab, pointing to Father, Source, and generative creative power. But attached to this root is the Aramaic suffix that signals an ongoing, active, breathing process, a continuous act, not a completed event. The result is a word that means something far closer to the breathing, living source of all being, the divine breath that is not a static fact, but a continuous, generative, creative act happening right now, in this moment, in you, through you. When Jesus invoked Abwoon, he was not calling on a distant deity. He was pointing every listener back to the divine breath, already active within their own chest, within the involuntary rise and fall that was occurring in their body at that exact moment. Here is why this is the most precise antidote to anxiety that any tradition has ever produced. Anxiety pulls human consciousness entirely into time, into future catastrophes that have not happened, into past wounds that never fully healed. It is always elsewhere, always in a moment that is not this one. Abwoon is the opposite of elsewhere. It is the most radically present word in the entire Aramaic spiritual vocabulary. It calls the scattered mind back into the breath. This breath, right now, which is exactly where truth waits and where transformation has always lived. When Jesus opened his teachings with Abwoon, he was deploying sound as medicine. He was resetting the interior climate of his listeners before a single concept had entered their minds. The anxious mind that arrived at the teaching, full of its own noise and its own defended conclusions, found itself quietly reorganized by the frequency of this invocation, not because it was commanded to change, but because the sound itself created the interior conditions in which change becomes not just possible, but natural. If these Gnostic teachings are awakening a desire for inner transformation within you, we prepared Dois Guides, the sacred words where this journey begins. The link is pinned in the comments. There is a pattern woven throughout the Gospels that becomes unmistakable once you know what you are looking for. Every time Jesus attempted to teach in an environment charged with hostility, defensiveness, or anxiety-driven resistance, the words he offered landed flat. The Pharisees heard the very same teachings as the disciples sitting closest to him, but received them as threat rather than gift. The crowds that came in anger left unchanged, but those who arrived with something genuinely open in them. The paralyzed man lowered through a roof by his friends, the woman who pressed through a dense crowd just to touch the hem of his garment, the disciples who grew quiet in the stillness of the boat on the lake. They were transformed, sometimes in a single moment. The variable was not the eloquence of the teacher. The variable was the interior state of the receiver. This distinction sits at the absolute heart of what Jesus was addressing with the invocation of Abwoon. Is not simply an uncomfortable emotion to be managed or overcome through willpower. In the architecture of Aramaic spiritual understanding, anxiety represents a specific and diagnosable spiritual condition. The condition of being severed from the divine breath, disconnected from Abwoon itself. The ancient Somatic word root that corresponds to anxiety carries the meaning of constriction, a narrowing, a tightening, a collapsing inward upon the frightened self. It is the exact and precise opposite of the root structure of Abwoon, which radiates outward, expands, breathes, and opens toward the source of all life. When a person is held by anxiety, their capacity to receive spiritual truth narrows to nearly zero. They are not open to new understanding. They are scanning everything that enters for confirmation of what they already fear. Their entire inner system becomes a fortress, not a temple, and a fortress, however safe it feels from the inside, cannot receive anything transforming from the outside. Truth passes by its walls. Wisdom knocks on its gates and is turned away, unchanged. The listener is physically present in the teaching, but spiritually absent from it, and no degree of eloquence or sincerity from the teacher can bridge that specific gap. Jesus addressed this directly and consistently. He did not argue with the Pharisees' defenses or attempt to dismantle their anxiety-driven resistance through theological debate. He consistently redirected attention to the breath, to presence, to the kingdom that is already and has always been within. And he began that redirection with Abwoon, not as the final destination, but as the opening preparation, the interior softening that made everything that followed capable of entering and doing its work. The receiver was transformed before the teaching began. That was always the design. The invocation, Abwoon as Jesus used it, can be understood through three distinct interior movements. 3 sequential shifts that occurred when this word was spoken in its full Aramaic resonance before a teaching. These movements were never meant to be analyzed from a distance as theological concepts. They were experiential events, transitions of interior state, that prepared the listener to receive truth at a depth far below the level of the intellect. The first movement is the movement of breath. The phonetic structure of Abwoon is built from open vowels and vibrating consonants that, when spoken aloud in the Aramaic tradition, naturally invite a deepening of the breath. This is not accidental design. Jesus taught within the Semitic wisdom tradition, which held as foundational the understanding that breath is the most direct and available pathway between human experience and divine presence. The Aramaic word for spirit, rucha, is the same word used for breath and for wind. When Abwoon is spoken and the breath naturally deepens in response, the spirit is literally moved. The anxious body, which has been locked in, tight, shallow, fear-paced breathing, suddenly drops into a longer, older, more sacred rhythm. In that shift alone, the first wall of anxiety falls. The second movement is the movement of openness. Once the breath shifts, something in the chest and in the mind releases along with it. The grip of self-protection loosens. Aramaic scholars describe this transition as moving from the contracted state, the closed fist of the freed self, into the expanded state that Jesus elsewhere described as the condition of the little child, trusting, present, and radically available to what is real. In this expanded state, truth does not need to fight its way past defenses. It simply arrives, the way light arrives naturally when curtains are finally drawn back from a window. The third movement is the movement of unity. Abwoon carries within its very structure an implicit and living declaration that the breath moving inside you and the breath of the divine are not two separate things meeting across a distance. They are the same breath. Not symbolically, not as a comforting metaphor. In the Aramaic cosmology that shaped everything Jesus taught, this was taken as literal, structural reality. When that unity is remembered, even for a single moment of genuine recognition, the anxious experience of being isolated, alone, and spiritually unprotected collapses, and in the open space that remains, truth finds its home and begins its work. If this teaching is stirring something in your heart and you wish to explore it further, we prepared Doyce guides that explains the first sacred words where the journey begins, their layers of meaning, and the transformation they carry. The link is pinned in the comments. The ancient Aramaic invocation Abwoon does not belong only to the hillsides of Galilee, or to the 12 disciples who stood in the physical presence of Jesus 2,000 years ago. It was never designed to belong only to them. Jesus himself made this explicit and repeated it with consistent emphasis throughout his teaching. The kingdom, the divine breath, the source, these are not above you, not beyond you, not reserved for a future spiritual elevation you have not yet earned. They are within you. Now, the practice of Abwoon is simply the practice of returning to that reality and using the ancient sound itself as the living technology of return. Here is how this invocation can be applied directly and practically to the anxiety that is blocking your capacity to receive truth in your daily life. Begin your mornings before the news has had its first word with you, before the notifications have begun competing for your attention, before the first anxious thought of the day has gathered any momentum, with 3 deliberate, conscious utterances of Abwoon. Speak it aloud. Let the A be open wide in your chest. Let the wound vibrate forward and outward through your whole body. Feel the specific breath that carries the sound as it leaves you. This is not performance or religious ritual. This is activation. You are doing precisely what Jesus did before every teaching. You are preparing the ground. As you speak Abwoon, place one hand gently on your chest. This was a common and intentional practice in the Somatic wisdom tradition, grounding the sacred sound in the body. In the physical seat of what Aramaic tradition calls the leph, the heart-mind that governs perception and receives truth. The chest is where anxiety tends to make its home, where the tightening and the closing first announce themselves. It is also, in the Aramaic understanding, where the divine breath most directly meets and activates human experience. Placing your hand there, while invoking Abwoon, is a deliberate declaration to every layer of your being. I am returning to the source. I am releasing the Constriction, EMOP. Practice this before prayer, before you open any sacred text, before any conversation that carries genuine weight, a difficult relational exchange, a decision that will shape the coming months. Any moment where you need to be fully and genuinely present rather than anxiously defended behind layers of preformed conclusion. Jesus did not reserve the invocation of Abwoon for public teaching alone. The Aramaic tradition teaches that he returned to this breath word as a continuous living practice. Throughout his days, a constant, quiet realignment that kept the channel open, the mind uncluttered, and the heart fully available to whatever truth the Father wished to deliver in that moment. It is available to you in the same way, right now, in this life. What Jesus understood about human beings, and what he encoded into the Aramaic invocation Abwoon at the opening of every teaching he gave, is something that no amount of discipline, positive thinking, or intellectual effort can replicate or replace. He understood that truth does not simply need to be spoken clearly and with authority. It needs to land in prepared soil. And the single greatest obstacle to that preparation in the first century and in this one is the anxious mind that arrives already full, already defended, already braced against the very transformation it most deeply needs. Abwoon was his answer, not a lengthy ceremony or a complicated theological prerequisite, a single Aramaic word, spoken, breathed, activated, that accomplished the interior work that all the willpower in the world cannot perform by force. It brought the listener back to the divine breath, back to the source, back to the spacious, trusting, radically present interior state where truth can finally arrive with its full, undiminished, transforming weight. This is the teaching beneath the teaching, the preparation beneath the preparation. The key that unlocks the door through which everything else was always trying to enter. Now that you know it exists, you cannot unhear it. You will read the Gospels differently. You will approach prayer differently. You will understand why certain spiritual encounters shattered and rebuilt something inside you while others passed over you like weather. And you will know with precision what to do the next time you need to be genuinely, deeply, and completely open to what is true. The Aramaic invocation of Jesus is not a relic preserved behind theological glass. It is a living technology built for human beings in every century, including this one. Speak Abwoon. Let the breath find its depth. Let the anxiety lose its absolute grip, and then receive fully, openly, without the armor of fear, whatever truth has already been waiting at the threshold of your awareness, patient as breath, ancient as light. Visit Divine Light Academy, my site dedicated to bridging ancient spirituality and modern living. There you will find my advanced guides and a deep journey into Aramaic, the living language of the masters designed to help you access states of deep resonance, clarity, and personal revelation. The link is pinned in the comments. Get ready. In the next video, I will reveal more sacred Aramaic words that unlock deeper spiritual understanding. Turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Right now, before you close this video, come to the comments and tell us, what did you feel? What shifted? We read every single response. And if this teaching found you today, subscribe to this channel. Every week, we go deeper into the ancient frequency codes that were always meant to be yours.